Over to you, Heidi.
Can you hear me, Norma?
Yes, you can start.
Great. Okay. Sorry, everybody. Welcome to MISTRA's Youth Month webinar on the theme of youth in the time of a global pandemic. Today, we're going to have some authors from one of our priority research projects on youth and national development presenting a working paper to us. I'd just like everybody a bit of background to MISTRA's ERP on youth and national development. So today's working paper is development, and the project really explores the role that youth can and do play in national development and the challenges and possibilities for the future. It brings together research-led insights from academia, from practitioners and activists, many of whom are young people themselves, and who offer analysis from their respective fields in which they work. The project's been ongoing since the middle of last year, and it will culminate in the launch of the book toward the end of the year, 2021. In addition to the book, MISTRA will publish a policy brief that draws on the findings of the research. We'll also be launching a couple of the book's chapters as working papers, and the first of those as we celebrate Youth Month. And it's an especially topical section on the impact of COVID-19.
Apologies, ladies and gentlemen, we're losing Heidi. I think she's experiencing connectivity issues. Heidi, we lost you there.
Sorry about that. I think I lost a bit of connection. Okay, let me just recap briefly. So one of the chapters of the forthcoming MISTRA publication is being presented today as a working paper. And it reflects particularly topically on the impact of COVID-19 on young people, and particularly on their employment status and mental health. The Youth and National Development Project MISTRA was launched against the backdrop of the South African government's National Youth Policy for 2020 to 2030, and the 2015 to 2020 National Youth Policy, as well as a range of 94 policy provisions, interventions that have sought to tend in some way to of youth development. We know that young people aged between 24 constitute over a third national population. And here, as across the continent, there are concerns about the realization of what should be democratic dividend of the youth population. But young people in particular bear of economic marginalization from South Africans. And policy on youth development at the same time, and today's working paper touches on this, has had a limited impact and has not been able to meaningfully address the exclusion experienced by many young people. So on the one hand, the focus of all context and policy focus on people, but also at the same time of youth disaffection, particularly following the 2008 global financial crash, and of course against the backdrop of the Arab Spring. And to this, of course, we can now add the impact of COVID-19 on young people, and that's what's addressed by presenting us today. we can locate youth in a global context, that the focus of MISTRA's project is on the specific features and challenges of youth development in South Africa that arise from social contexts that are specific to South history. And especially that the contributions to the project really speak to the intersectional nature of many of the development challenges that impact young people back from more meaningful participation and inclusion. So the project really seeks to examine the nature of structural and contextual challenges that impede the participation of youth in development, as well as possibilities and recommendations, effective policies and interventions moving into the future. At the same time, the project and the research into it advocates for the idea of young people as active agents in the development process. And the ways in which youth demonstrate this agency in multiple ways. So agency amongst young people to the project, one of which is being presented to us today. But contributors to the project, which will feed into the book being launched toward the end of the year, examines young people's role in development across a number of themes. So looking at political engagement and activism, identity formation and expression, how the youth negotiate pathways through education, the structural challenges facing youth, the policy environment and its limitations, forms of economic participation and exclusion, and labor market dynamics. So this is one of the first engagements over the outputs of the project, and we look forward to more of those over coming months. The copy of the working paper being presented today is now available on the MISTRA website, so if you haven't received it already, you can read and refer to it afterwards. But let me now just introduce the speakers to you. They've all contributed to the project, and particularly by bringing their expertise on youth employment to today's paper. So there's Professor Ariana Delanoy, who is Associate Professor at the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit at Cape Town, University of Cape Town, and on youth transitions to adulthood in a context of poverty and inequality. She's the principal investigator on the SA Youth Explorer project that presents data on youth well-being and service delivery, and on the basic package of support, which aims to provide comprehensive support to young people who are not in employment, education, or training. And Prof. Delanoy is also one of the co-editors of the MISTRA book on youth and national development to be published later this year, along with Professor Malose Langa. Our other speaker is Gibson Muduriza, who is lecturer in the Department of Economics and Finance at the University of the Free State, and previously a postdoctoral fellow at Soldru at UCT. And his research is focused on development economics, and in particular on local labour markets, inequality, poverty, and youth well-being. And we also have Mario Meyer, who is part of the Youth Capital team at the DG Murray Trust. And Youth Capital is a youth-led advocacy and mobilisation campaign that focuses on tackling issues of youth unemployment. Mario has also previously been involved in the DG Murray Trust's grant funding work focused on supporting young people to get their first decent job. So I'm going to hand over to both of them now. Thank you, all three of you, for coming to speak to us today. I'll hand over to you, Ariana.
Thank you so much, Heidi, for the introductions. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for the support. Thank you all for being here and for showing an interest in the work. As Heidi mentioned, many of us, and definitely people on the team for this presentation, have been working with and alongside young people for a really long period of time. And when COVID hit the country last year and the level 5 lockdown was announced, we very quickly realized the potentially devastating effect this was going to have on young people's lives. Gibson, you can move on to the next slide. Sorry to do this from a distance. We very quickly picked up indications of young people in the country struggling with the extended restrictions of the lockdown level 5. We understood there were mental health problems very early on, but we also saw across the world already the effects of lockdown measures on the labor market, on education and other aspects of young people's well-being. Over the months then, as South Africa moved through different stages of lockdown and different stages of restrictions, various hubs of research started to arise, indicating the disproportionate effect of COVID-19 as a pandemic, as an illness, as a pandemic, and the effects of lockdown, especially on vulnerable groups across different countries. In South Africa, we knew already then that young people were then and are one of the most vulnerable groups already before the pandemic. And so we were really interested in trying to understand exactly what was going on in young people's lives, how severe the effects of the pandemic and the lockdown were on their lives, and how they were dealing with all of this. Colleagues at various research institutes also stuck their heads together to try and understand how we could measure the impact on vulnerable groups beyond young people alone. So we went back and had a look at what the situation of young people was like just before the lockdown started. And we know that already then, among young people aged 18 to 35, 42% were living in income poverty, 42% were unemployed. So we're talking about millions of young people. 10 million young people were not in education, employment, or training. The strict lockdown measures that were implemented to slow the spread of the virus were very likely to worsen the situation, especially for unemployed young people and those who are not in education, employment, and training, but obviously also had an effect on education itself. If we wanted to try and understand how best to support young people and how to remedy some of the situation, we needed to get a better understanding of what the impact of COVID-19 has been on their lives. So that is the purpose of this particular paper that we'll be presenting today, and Gibson will be talking in much detail about the data. For this particular paper, put together profiles of how labor market and mental health outcomes of young people have changed in the period or between the period before the COVID-19 related lockdown and then during the stages of the different lockdowns. We used National Income Dynamic Survey data of 2017, wave 5, as the data that give us an indication of how young people were doing before the pandemic. And then, as I said, several colleagues around the country stuck their heads together and rolled out the National Income Dynamic Survey Corona Rapid Mobile Survey, which was implemented in a different way than the normal NIDS survey, but contains several waves that allow us to follow how a cohort of people is doing over time under the COVID-19 related lockdowns. Over to Gibson to talk through the data. Gibson, I think you are still muted.
Okay, sorry about that. So thank you, Ariane, for the introduction. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge the presence of a number of my colleagues from my department. So thank you for joining our presentation. So I'll pick it from here and start with the data, just a description of the data that we used for our study. Like Ariane has said, we used the 2017 NIDS Wave 5 data and 2020 NIDS CREM Wave 1 and 2 data sets. So the advantage of using the NIDS dataset is that it's a national representative survey, which was been collected since 2008 in a period of 2 years. And the 5th wave was collected in 2017, like we said. Then when you look at the NIDS CREM dataset, it's also a nationally representative survey, which is based on the NIDS CREM, which is also based on the NIDS sampling framework for 2017. But when you look at the NIDS CREM, like Ariane said, it was collected in a different way. And these two surveys, the Wave 1 and Wave 2, Wave 1 was collected between May and June. And what is interesting is for Wave 1, they asked questions to do with employment for February, which is the period just before the lockdown. And they also collected information for employment for April, which is the period where we're in level 5, which is the hard lockdown. Then when we look at NIDS CREM Wave 2, it was collected between July and August. And what we see is they collected employment information specifically for June, which was the level 3 lockdown. But in terms of these 3 data sets, we used Wave 1 and 2 to derive labor market outcomes, where we specifically looked at unemployment rate, employment to population ratio, and employment gains and losses. Then from 2017 needs were 5 and 2020 needs CREM. We used these two surveys to derive and measure for depressive symptoms, and to capture depressive symptoms, needs CREM wave 5 used the CESD 10 scale, which is a score which ranges from 0 to 30, and the needs CREM wave 2 used PHQ2 scale, which ranges from 3 to 6, where between these different scores that we have, the higher the score, the higher also the depressive symptoms for a particular youth or a particular individual. So when you look at it, these two instruments, they are different. So to allow for comparability, we follow what has been done in the literature and create a binary depressive symptom indicator, where we use different cutoff points, where we use greater than or equal to 12% for the CASD 10 scale and greater than or equal to 3 for the PHQ2 scale. So these are the two scales that we're going to use for our measure for depressive symptoms. The first thing that I'll try to go through our sample characteristics here. I'm just trying to move my screen away from the screen here. So when you look at the sample characteristics for the three surveys that we are using here, what we see is the bulk of the youth actually in the age group 18 to 24, they are Black, they have less than metric, and they also reside in urban areas. So this is the composition of the youth that we actually were part of our sample. And for gender, we see that is almost an equal split, which is a 50-50 for the needs wave 5. And for the needs CREM wave 1 and 2, we see slightly more females there. I'll go on to discuss initially our labor market outcomes, where I start by the unemployment rate for April and June. So April is the period where we were in the hard lockdown, which is level 5, and June is the period where we're in level 3 lockdown. So we start by comparing the unemployment rate for youth and adults, and we're going to show the narrow and the broad unemployment rate, where the narrow unemployment rate just looks at those who are strictly unemployed, and the broad unemployment rate includes those who are discouraged. The first thing that we see is when we look at youth unemployment rate, we actually see that is significantly higher compared to adult unemployment rate, where if we had to look in April, we see that youth unemployment rate was about 30% compared to adults, which was about 15%. So it was almost 2 times more. And the same applies when we look at the broader definition of unemployment rate as well, where it's also higher for youth compared to adults. Then when we move from April to June, what we see is we see an increase in an unemployment rate for both youth and adults, where the narrow unemployment rate increased by about 4 percentage points. But when you look at the broader unemployment rate, we see that for youth, it increased by about 6 percentage points, while for adults, it increased about 3 percentage points. Then the next thing that we also see is, as much as we have these difference in the increase in unemployment rate and the high unemployment rate for youth, we also see that unemployment rate actually varies across different youth groups, where if we are to look in April and we look at the narrow definition of unemployment rate, we see that unemployment rate was significantly high for younger youth who were 18 to 24. It was also higher for females, for Asians or Indians, for those with metric, and for rural and urban, we see that it's almost an equal proportion there. Then when we move over time to June, we actually see that unemployment rate increased significantly for younger youth with about 7 percentage points. For Blacks, they increased about 6 percentage points, and for whites, which is rather surprising, where it increased by about 7 percentage points. And for those with less than metric, which I think is something that we could expect in terms of how the labor market behaves in terms of these shocks. Then also for rural and urban, we actually see that there is a huge increase for those who were in rural areas. The same thing also applies for the broad definition of unemployment, which I think there's no need for me to talk about the broader definition of unemployment, because the same sort of groups of youth who witnessed a significant increase in unemployment are also the same that for the broader definition there. Next thing that I want to look at is to look at youth unemployment rate, which is the employment of youth relative to the youth population itself. We want to look at how has the employment for youth changed over time, given the different periods of the lockdown. So the first thing that we start with, we have February, which is the pre-lockdown period, and we have April level 5, June level 3. We start by comparing our youth to our adults, where we see for February here, we see that youth, actually the employment rate here was relatively lower compared to adults, where it's 50% compared to 64%. And the same thing applies for the other months as well. But over time, when we look at youth, what we see is the proportion of youth who were employed decreased from 50 to about 42%, and it further in April, and it further decreased to 41% in June. The same trend is also witnessed for adults for February to April, but we see that there is a recovery for June in terms of adults here. And all in all, when we look at it at the whole period, which is February to June, we see that youth unemployment actually decreased by about 9 percentage points. What is interesting is when you look at April to June, which is a period where the lockdown restrictions were being lessened, we actually see that adult employment actually improved compared to youth unemployment, which continued to decrease, but with quite a small percentage, which is just 0.5. Then the next thing, if we are to look at youth employment across different youth groups, we actually see that for February, employment was significantly higher for the 30 to 35 age group. It was higher for male and for whites, and for those with higher education and those in urban areas. Then over time, what we see is, I want to concentrate with the last column, which is the column for the entire period, which is February to June. What we see is employment decreased significantly for the relatively older youth, 30 to 35. It also decreased significantly for females here compared to our male counterparts. And interestingly, there was actually an increase in employment for whites and Asians here, while for blacks and colors, it actually decreased significantly. And for those with lower than metric, we actually see that employment actually decreased by about 11 percentage points. Same thing with those in rural areas, where it decreased by about 13 percentage points. But what we know with the lockdown, what the lockdown did is, when companies closed down, there are a lot of workers who were employed, but they were laid off in terms of they were given like special leave so that they are not going to work. So we want to remove this group of workers from our ratio of employment and see what happened to employment. What you actually see is, if we just look at the youth here, where we see that in February, it was 50% of youth were employed, and this decreased to about 32% in April, which is a decrease of about 18%. And when we look for the whole period, it's a decrease of about 13 percentage points, which compared to 9 percentage points from the previous table that I looked at. And when you look at the different youth groups, we see that the same trend happens, where there is significant decrease in employment from February to April. Then April to June, we see some recoveries in almost all the groups here. As you can see from this column here, we see some recoveries. But when you look at the entire period, we actually see that almost all the groups actually lost employment. Okay. The next thing that we want to look at, we have pre-transition period, and we want to look at how has youth employment changed over time. And where we have the first transition period is our February to April. Then we have April to June, and we also have February to June, which is the entire time period. So the first thing that we see with this transition matrix is, for about 7% of youth who were not employed in February, were now employed in April. Then when we look, about 29% of youth who were employed in February, they were no longer employed in April. So this is actually a huge proportion to lose within that short space of time. So we are moving from immediately before lockdown to immediately within the lockdown, where about 29% loses employment. Then when we go on to, and we also have this 14% of workers who were no longer going to work. They were still employed, but they were laid off because of when companies closed down. So the same thing when go on to April and June, what we see is 13% of those youth who were not employed in April, they were now employed in June, while 24% of youth were employed in April, they were no longer employed in June. And what is even worrying is for those who were placed on special leave, about 23% of those who were placed on special leave in April, they were no longer employed in June, which I think 23% is actually a huge proportion in a way. Then when you look at the entire period, which is February to June, we see that 14% of those who were employed in February, they were now employed in June. Then of those who were employed in February, 34% of them were no longer employed in June. So to just summarize this table, what we see is there is a lot of instability within the labor market in South Africa for youth. And this is a very short space of time, which is just February to June. And we see these movements within the labor market showing the huge churning that youth actually experience this short space of time. The next thing that I do is in this paper is to look at the rate of job losses or job gains between February and June. I didn't look at the other transition. I just look at February and June, which is the entire period. And what is interesting is when I just start looking at the age groups here, the first thing that we see is the youth who are 18 to 24, the rate of job losses was significantly high, which is over 50% compared to other age groups, which is less than 30%. And at the same time, the rate of job gains for these youth who are 18 to 24 is also lower compared to other age groups. And another group which is interesting to look at is the gender dynamic, where we see that females had a higher rate of job losses compared to their male counterparts, but at the same time, the female also had lower rate of gaining jobs compared to their male counterparts. And I'll just talk more again about on education, where we see that youth with less than matric had a higher job loss rate compared to other education levels. Well, when we look at job gains, it's almost equal for those with less than matric and those with higher education. I'll leave the other groups because I think the explanation is clear and the same. In conclusion, in terms of the labor market outcomes, what we see is youth unemployment rate is significantly high, and it even increased during the lockdown, despite the lessening of the lockdown measures. Then there are fewer youth who managed to move from being unemployed to being employed during this different transition. And while very little youth with more youth who actually became unemployed during this same time period. Then in terms of job losses, what we see is these job losses were concentrated among youth who were already disadvantaged or vulnerable way before the pandemic. And these are youth who are relatively young, female, African, and those with less education, and those in rural areas. And I think what is worrying about this group of young people is that they were less likely to gain employment, yet at the same time, they were also more likely to lose their employment, which is putting them even at a more vulnerable position than they were to pile up the pressure on what they were before the pandemic. I'll briefly talk about the mental health status, which I think is going to be quick. We said to determine the prevalence of depressive symptoms, we use a cutoff score of 12 and a cutoff score of 3. And any youth who exhibits a score which is higher than these cutoff scores actually exhibit depressive symptoms. We start by comparing the depressive symptom score from youth and adults. And what we see is the prevalence of depressive symptoms between youth and adults was relatively similar, where we see for 2017, it's about 13% for youth and it's about 16% for adults. For 2020, it's about 23% for youth and 25% for adults. But what we see is over time, there is a significant increase in mental health for both youth and adults, where for youth it increased from 13% to 23%, and for adults it increased from 16% to 25%. So this may actually be the impact of what COVID pandemic and the lockdown actually did to youth and adult mental health outcomes, looking at the pre-lockdown period and during the lockdown period. The next thing that we do is we look at depressive symptoms across different youth groups. The first thing that we notice is when we look at the different youth groups, we see that in 2017, the prevalence was roughly similar, where the lowest was 11% for those with higher than matric, and it was highest for those with matric, which was about 15%. But when we move on to 2020, which is our lockdown period, we see that depressive symptoms increase significantly across all groups of young people, with significant increase among the non-African, where it increased from 12 to 33%. An interesting one is for education, where we see that for those with higher education, depressive symptoms increase from 11% to 26%, which is a huge increase. And what has been found in the literature is that while education is actually act as a cushion during these times for pandemics, for this particular period, it didn't act as a cushion. And it has been said that people with higher education, they're actually following these depressive symptom news a lot more compared to other people. And this, I think, actually contributes to them having more depressive symptoms compared to those with lower education. So in summary, what we see is the COVID-19 pandemic actually had a significant impact on the mental health status for young people in South Africa, where we see a worsening mental health outcomes for young people with depressive symptoms having increased from between 2017 and 2020 for the overall sample and across different youth groups. What is even more worrying is the fact that for the NIDS-CREM survey, which wave 3, which was collected for October, we actually see that depressive symptoms continue to increase, yet we're actually at level 3, at level 1 at that particular time, which is actually showing us, despite the lessening of the lockdown measures, depressive symptoms continue to increase among youth and the general population. So I'll end my presentation here, then I'll hand over to Mario to give us a discussion of a discussion and recommendations from our study. Okay, over to you, Mario.
Thank you very much, Gibson. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. Let me just begin by saying that this particular section of this chapter was contributed to by myself, but also my colleagues, Crystal Duncan-Williams, who's on the webinar today, and also Shakira Maharaj, as I've just been tasked to share the recommendations today. But it's been a collective effort with the three of us, along with Ariane and Gibson. We got involved with the project, and Ariane reached out to us and asked if we'd be able to bring to bear the lived experiences of young people in the chapter findings. And that's what we initially set out to do. We wanted to bring in our own experiences at Youth Capital and at the DG Murray Trust within the youth portfolio, particularly. We wanted to bring in our experiences of working with youth organizations and working with young people. But we found that we didn't quite have the data we needed to share about the qualitative experiences of young people. And so we shifted a little bit to then think about what policy recommendations could we bring into the chapter based on our experiences at Youth Capital and at the DG Murray Trust. And so that's what we aimed to do, along with Ariane and Gibson's input into that. And so I'll briefly just speak to the recommendations we have put forth in this chapter. And as Gibson has shared in the data results, the findings in the chapter show that COVID-19 has exacerbated the plight of young people. And young people faced, most young people in South Africa faced a lot of challenges prior to COVID. And it's been made worse since COVID, and particularly for young people who were vulnerable before the pandemic. Their situations have been made far more challenging because of the pandemic. And as the analysis has showed, about 1.5 million young people 18 to 35 years old lost their jobs between February and June last year. And in addition, the incidence of mental health problems has also been on the increase since before the pandemic. And so in the face of these challenges, pre-COVID and post-COVID. We have a window of opportunity where we can think and do differently in our efforts to improve outcomes for young people. We don't have a shortage of policy, youth development policy in South Africa. There are quite a range of legislative and policy instruments. And we think that the shortcoming has been in coordination between stakeholders and also in monitoring and evaluating the implementations of these projects and the impacts, and including young people in both their design and their implementation. And we think that as the national focus shifts increasingly towards recovery, that young people should feature centrally in those discussions, in the design of interventions, in the implementation of interventions. And the findings of the chapter show that the pandemic has had a significant effect on youth, both youth in the labor market and youth in the education system. And therefore, it's quite important that we provide support to young people as they progress through both the education system and towards sustainable livelihoods, to become the independent, productive, thriving adults that the vast majority of young people want to be, but struggle to be because of the structural challenges that they face on a daily basis. So as we're thinking about interventions to build back better, and there has been both here and globally a lot of talk around building back better, we put forward that we should focus on both youth who are in the labor market and youth who are in the education system. And that's where the recommendations we've put forward focus on. Next slide, please, Gibson. Thank you. And so I'll go through each focus area of recommendations that we put forward in the chapter and just share a little bit around that. So with education, we know from the research that education is a critical enabler for labor market transitions, actually getting employed, and having some form of stability in being employed. And the findings in the chapter show that higher levels of education are associated with greater job security, and people who had a higher qualification, higher than matric, experience fewer job losses than those with less than matric. And we've had a lot of reports since lockdown started about the educational losses that has occurred, particularly at the schooling level and particularly in under-resourced schools. One report that was published in the Mail and Guardian earlier this year said that it could take up until 2028 to recover from the learning losses that occurred last year. And that's a long time. And there's one high school teacher I know who made the point to me that as difficult as last year was for the matrics of last year, they at least had the benefit of having got to grade 11 without any disruptions to their education. And his point to me was that the syllabus for matric is largely covered by grade 11, and so they, in that sense, were okay. And his concern was more around the matrics of 2021 who were in grade 11 last year, and also the grade 10s of last year who are now in grade 11s, and the challenge of them catching up on the learning losses. And so we may find, as going forward, we may find that the real challenge of the learning losses come to bear for the matrics of this year and future matrics. And so we think it's quite important to intervene here, both for learners, those in the schooling system, but also for those in post-school education and training system for students. We think it's important to engage with learners and students so that they are encouraged to stay connected to school, to college, to university, even when physical access is minimal or not allowed. And particularly the issue of certification. As the findings in the chapter show, those who have at least a matric and certainly higher than matric, their prospects in the labor market are much improved compared to those who do not have a matric. And there are two particular areas that we think could be very helpful to maximizing certification to ensure that more young people have the certification to give them access to further learning opportunities, or to be able to signal their skills and their competencies in the labor market so that they could pursue an avenue of employment. Those two are particularly the General Education Certificate, also called the Grade 9 Leaving Certificate, which is scheduled to roll out in 2023. We think that that is one intervention that could help quite a bit to increase the number of young people who have a formal certification that could give them access to further learning in the post-school education and training system or into the labor market. And the other is the Second Chance. We recently at Youth Capital asked RECEP at Stellenbosch University to do research for us on the Second Chance Matric program, which is run by the Department of Basic Education. And the study found that at any given time, about 250,000 young people are navigating their way through the Second Chance Matric program, trying a second or third, or perhaps even more times attempt at the matric. And so we think those are opportunities where we could provide greater support to young people and helping more young people to become certified. And what's critical there is providing both the academic catch-up support and the wraparound support, and leveraging a combination of no-tech, low-tech and high-tech solutions to provide that support and increase certification amongst young people. Second focus area is social assistance for unemployed young people. So prior to COVID-19, young people generally did not qualify for social assistance from the social protection system. Those who did qualify were children, the elderly, people with disabilities, and those in short-term temporary distress situations. Young people, for the most part, were excluded. This changed with COVID with the Social Relief of Distress grant, the 350 grant that ended in April, that provided to individuals 18 and older who are unemployed and didn't receive any form of income or social grants. And we think that this is an area that could be very impactful for young people, providing a form of social assistance as a component of economic recovery. If you will, a work seeker support grant for young people who are currently disconnected from employment. We think that providing reliable assistance to young people who are unemployed would provide a much needed safety net, both to help them cover work seeking costs, because looking for work is very expensive. And most young people who are unemployed don't have the financial means to look for work, but also to counter discouragement. From the research that discouragement has been increasing over the last many years, and a comprehensive social assistance program could help to counter that discouragement and keep hope alive in young people who are looking for work. The next focus area is mental health interventions. As Gibson has shared, the findings in the chapter show a significant increase in depressive symptoms amongst youth. However, access to mental health support is severely constrained. Public health facilities, for the most part, are inadequately resourced to provide the mental health support that many people in the general population, and also specifically young people, need, particularly people who do not have medical aid, medical insurance. The numbers of people who are uninsured, medically uninsured, and who need mental health support, numbers of those who actually get them are alarmingly low. So there's a need for improved access to mental health support, and probably a lot of scope for creativity around how that mental health support is delivered, given the constraints on the public healthcare system. Now, the next focus area is navigation support for young people, or transition support, interventions that can guide young people into long-term sustainable livelihoods, increasing their education and skills levels, also building employer confidence. So these kinds of interventions are getting a lot of attention at the moment. And we think that these are particularly important interventions given the importance of access to social networks and social capital. A lot of young people don't have that. A large number of young people from income poor households who don't live with an employed adult, and so their social networks are limited. And so interventions like navigation support could be particularly helpful. So ones like the National Pathway Management Network that was officially launched last week by the President on Youth Day. It aims to connect young people to learning and earning opportunities and bypassing the limitations of data costs, given that the site is zero rated. And then also the basic package of support for youth, which is the project Ariane is involved with at Saldru, along with other academic and social partners. And this project is seeking to ensure that youth who are in that need state to stay engaged with social and economic structures through the provision of face-to-face long-term navigation support, as well as referral to local services, finding out where they are and what their best next step is to help them progress, whether that's into education or training or into employment. So these kinds of interventions and others like it, these transition support interventions, are crucial to support and connect young people as they navigate between educational and employment prospects. And then the second last focus area that we touch on in the chapter is digital access. As we know, in this day and age, that access to information and social networks is critical for linking youth to opportunities and services. However, many young people are disconnected from leveraging these knowledge and networking resources because of the digital divide, so the gaps in access to modern ICT. And the crucial component of improving digital access is infrastructure. One of the key components of the economic reconstruction and development plan is developing new models to expand access to digital technology. And so there's a great need to expand access in terms of infrastructure, but also expanding access in terms of data costs. One of the main barriers to digital access is the cost of data. Even though the major mobile network operators have in recent times decreased the cost of data, it's still expensive for many young people, too expensive. During lockdown, one of the government's interventions to mitigate the national state of disaster was the zero rating of certain websites, particularly health, basic education, and higher education and training. And we think that these are gains that shouldn't be limited to the urgent circumstances of the pandemic, and that we could do a lot more in terms of providing access to learning and earning and work readiness material online by zero rating these content sources and making them available to young people irrespective of their network provider. I think at the moment, many zero-rated sites or access to zero-rated sites are limited depending on the network provider that one has. So we think that expanding access through zero rating could be a great help in providing access to learning and earning opportunities for young people. Much like the sayouth.mobi site is zero rated, we think that other sites, public benefit organization sites could be also zero rated. And then as well as expanding access through infrastructure, through reducing data costs or eliminating data costs entirely. The issue of digital literacy is also important. So even when a young person has access through a device and has working internet and is able to access, for example, a zero-rated site, they may not have the digital literacy skills to make use of those fully. So we think an area of work that is needed is in improving digital literacy as well. And then the final focus area in the chapter is public employment programs. So South Africa has kind of the EPWP and Expanded Public Works Program and Community Work Program, CWP. And particularly the EPWP is recognized as one of the better public employment programs in the world. And public employment programs is one of the priority interventions in the economic reconstruction and recovery plan, particularly in the form of the presidential employment stimulus, which has been designed to build on and complement existing public investment in employment creation. And we think that public employment programs should be opportunities that are maximized to ensure that young people get a foot into the labor market, and that there's a benefit as well for some of the other issues, such as in education. So, for example, the recently implemented basic education employment intervention, which placed young people in schools as education assistants or general school assistants, that had benefit both for the young people who were placed in those schools, but also for those schools themselves. At Youth Capital, we've recently done a survey to get a sense of the experience of both young people and schools who participated in the basic education employment intervention. And overwhelmingly, the feedback from both young people and schools has been that it's been a very positive experience. The young people benefited from being gainfully employed in schools, making a difference in the lives of learners, and the schools benefited by having the capacity of their teachers increase because they had less admin work and the like. And so we think public employment programs are a great opportunity to address the issue, to contribute to addressing to the issue of young people who are neat, but they are in and of themselves not the silver bullet, and they should be thought of as stepping stone opportunities, and people should be properly trained for whatever their responsibilities are in public employment programs. But there should also be a great emphasis on building their skills and their network so that they're equipped to find their next best step into the labor market or into further education. So those are the focus areas that we have in the chapter. I'll stop there, maybe hand over to Gibson or Ariane if they'd like to make any concluding remarks before we go into Q&A.
Thanks so much, Mario. That was a very comprehensive overview of not only the quantitative data or the findings that are coming out of the quantitative data, but also drawing in some of the experiences that the different organizations have, especially Youth Capital, in working with young people. So it isn't only a statistically driven chapter, but also draws on the experience of many of these organizations like Youth Capital that have been working with young people so closely. I think we should probably now give the floor to the participants in the room and see if there are any particular questions that we can help with.
Thanks, Ariana. Thanks, Gibson and Mario. Sorry, my sound was very poor earlier. I think I've rectified it, but please alert me if you can't hear anything. And we'll open up now to questions and discussion. If anyone would like to use the raising their hand option or to even post a question in the chat, that's fine. I'll start with one of the questions in the chat from Professor Villancomo. Thanking you for the discussion and saying that the study confirms that an excellent education is the ultimate liberator, even in difficult economic times and a COVID-19 affected world. His questions are, what was the study able to statistically indicate the numbers of underemployed youth during the COVID-19 period? And are the statistics on the number of discouraged youth workers, are there statistics on the number of discouraged youth workers? In other words, youth having completely opted out of the labour market. And he also just flags that the importance of quality teaching. I can't see any other questions for now. Do you perhaps want to start with that one?
Sure, thanks, Heidi. I'm going to leave the stats responses to Gibson. And then I'd like to come in after that about the discouragement for a moment.
Sure. Gibson?
Okay, sorry, I was just trying to get to the questions because I think I went off a bit when you were reading the questions. I was struggling to see the questions. Okay. So to respond to the question from underemployed youth, we didn't look specifically at underemployed youth in our study, but we looked specifically at the youth in terms of those who were just employed in terms of the narrow definition and the broader definition. Where the broader definition, that's where we included those who were discouraged. And what you can actually see, I think, from one of them, I tried to remove my slides so that I can see the questions. But from when we try to compare them for the broader definition of unemployment between the adults and youth, we actually see that the broader definition is the one that increased significantly for youth, meaning that we had an increase in the youth who actually became discouraged compared to adults during the pandemic. Then what else can I talk about? Yes, I think that's all that I can just say for now in terms of that question. Ariane, do you want to add something in terms of the discouraged?
Yes, but also maybe just on the underemployed youth. I don't know whether we have the numbers, but we did look at some point at the proportions of young people who were employed and in what kind of contract they were. And what is clear is that a lot of young people, even when they are employed, are in a very precarious situation in that the majority of them was employed in short-term contracts, potentially non-written contracts. When you say underemployment, if we define that broadly, we do know that there are large numbers of young people who are in unstable contracts, low income jobs, and without clarity on the actual duration. So very precarious employment, if there is any. When it comes to discouragement, so Gibson did present that in one of the slides, the proportion of young people that were discouraged before the pandemic, and then the increase in discouragement, which as Mario pointed out, we've seen increase over the years already. But I think one important point to keep in mind is that discouragement is not actually a static state for many of these young people. It isn't that it isn't as if the entire group of discouraged youth has completely opted out of the labor market. For some, it is a temporary state where they simply have become so despondent after the many attempts to either increase their skills or find a job or keep a job, that discouragement is almost the moment where they have to be for a while before they can gather their confidence and their agency again to put themselves out there again and go look for a job again, which is also why it is so important that we think about those interventions that actively reach out to young people and find ways to keep them connected or reconnected, because even among those who are discouraged, the point is not that they don't want to work. They haven't entirely given up on the idea of wanting to work. I think that that's quite important when we think about this group from a perspective of interventions. Thank you. I see there's some other questions. Heidi, do you want to take over?
Sure, thanks, Ariana, and Gibson as well for your responses. So another question here from Zenzo Moyo. Then he liked particularly the order and flow of the three presentations and says, it's likely that the COVID pandemic may not be the last pandemic to hit humanity in our lifetime. And therefore, this particular moment could be used as a lesson for better future adaptation to pandemics. Could one of the lessons be to radically change and shift our educational curriculum from ECD to university, so as to learn more towards entrepreneurship rather than employment. So gearing youth towards entrepreneurship rather than employment. And he says this then centralizes the role of education ministries to try and look beyond the brilliant statistics you've shared. So that's the first question. And then somebody else asking about whether the webinar is available online or being recorded, and yes, it is. Perhaps you could start with a reply to Zenzo's comments about entrepreneurship rather than, building entrepreneurship into the educational curriculum.
I'm happy to go first, and then maybe Mario and Gibson have some of their own insights to add. Zenzo, I think the point that I would agree with is that COVID is not necessarily the last pandemic or the last crisis to hit humanity and to affect young people in a drastic way. But I don't know whether the lesson is then to shift much more towards entrepreneurship. I think the need to build safety nets, as Mario mentioned, for young people and to find ways to keep them connected to systems is really important, so that they don't fall between the cracks of the systems that exist and are left to their own devices. So ways of building resilience and accurate, efficient, and effective knowledge about how the systems work is crucial, as is keeping them out of the direst levels of poverty. Shifting more towards entrepreneurship, I think, is an aspiration that has lived within the South African policy environment for a long time, and is definitely a parallel route that can be explored, and perhaps should be explored. But there too, we notice that, in fact, one of the chapters in the book touches upon this as well. Young people don't automatically become entrepreneurs. And so perhaps that is why you say build it into the curriculum. There's a definite need also there for a longer term provision of accurate and high quality levels of knowledge and support that would make it possible even for young people to take up an opportunity as an entrepreneur and then to really build that into something bigger. So I'm not entirely sure that it would need a radical shift, but rather a strengthening of a particular stream within the education system. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ariana. Gibson or Mario, do you want to add to that? Or otherwise we can move on to another question in the chat.
Happy to add my thoughts. For me, I think what COVID has done, it's both here and across the world, is to fast track us in questioning the relevance of the model we have been using to deliver education, both schooling and post-school education and training. So I think we've seen some of the shortcomings of the model when the crisis hit, and we've also seen innovations in education delivery, and so I think that we ought to be thinking creatively about how we design our education system and keeping what works and what's useful from the model of education delivery as we've known it. But then also thinking about bringing in those innovations and shifting our education system to be relevant for the 21st century and to meet the challenges of this day and age. So, for example, one thing that I heard not too long ago was the relevance of how we've traditionally done education at university. Let's say it's a 3-year undergrad degree, being on campus for 3 years and then moving on into the world of work. One different idea that I heard was perhaps or a model could look like is having one's first year of undergrad study on campus in class, and then being able to then do the second year onwards remotely, and including work experience in that time. So I think we need to think differently about education. Do we need as much time, for example, for some modules, some courses, some learnings as we have in the past? Or could they be shorter and delivered differently, etc.? And then just to add on to what Ariane said about entrepreneurship, I think just having it in the curriculum alone, probably not enough to increase entrepreneurship, the number of young people who get involved in entrepreneurship. I think providing support to young people who venture that route is important, providing a safety net, providing them with just some leeway to take risks and to fail, given the high rates of unsuccessful ventures in entrepreneurship.
Thanks, Mario. Let me move on to another question in the chat from Kosi Kubeka. Listening to the presentation, once again, we get confirmation that youth who are not in employment, education and training are still more disadvantaged than those who complete matric and beyond. And she asks, what about graduate employment? Where are we with that? What are the statistics? And should we be concerned? And she's asking when we're also going to have that conversation. Yeah, let's go with that question, and then I'll move on to the next comment. Gibson?
Okay, thank you. Let me respond to this one. So I have removed the slides that I was sharing, but yes, the NEET is still a concern. And I think when we look at what the COVID pandemic did, the NEET group is going to be even a bigger concern in the near future. The data set that we used, we couldn't come up with the NEET rate, but when one looks at the QLFS, which allows you to do that, you see that we are heading for even bigger problems there. Then when one looks at the graduate unemployment, so one of the slides that I presented on unemployment, we did disaggregate unemployment by education. And what you see is for those with higher than matric, we have an unemployment rate which stands at about 23%, which I think is a significantly high rate, which to answer this question, whether it's a concern, yes, it is a concern, because one would expect if you are a graduate, so this statistics is including those matric and higher. When one disaggregated further to just look with those specifically with a degree, the rate actually decreases slightly. We didn't do it specifically here because the numbers become very small for those with a degree and above. But when you compare with other countries, the rate of our graduate unemployment is significantly high in South Africa. And one question that I think I can pose to everyone who is in this chat is most probably to do with our own curriculums in our universities, in terms of, are we producing the graduates that our economy needs? Because if we are sitting with an economy where we have so many graduates, but at the same time, we have so many areas where we have these special skills where people are needed, that means there are a lot of degrees that we are still pumping out in terms of our universities, but that are not helping our economy in terms of shaping the employment of our youth and everyone. So when we look at it in terms of improving the graduate to lower graduate unemployment, I don't think it's something that can change overnight, but it might be something that needs to change in terms of how our curriculums are in terms of shifting to where we are strong as an economy. I support the point that was being, I think, raised by, is it Professor Nkomo, where it was talking about entrepreneurship. When you look at South Africa, maybe that's where we need to actually go, try to push our students and our kids more into vocational trainings rather than these educational where we go to universities and we end up with a lot of graduate unemployment. Okay, thank you. I think I can leave it here.
Can I quickly pop in?
Sure, Ariana.
I do think it's important to think about the group of young people who are NEET as a heterogeneous group. It isn't only made up of young people who did not complete their matric. It is a group of young people, while more than half of them did not, at any point in time, do not have a matric. There are large proportions of young people who do have a matric and some level of higher education. We do see that those young people who are NEET without a matric are the more vulnerable ones. They find it much more difficult to find employment or to reconnect to the education system. And so again, questions about how to support them to reconnect are really important. But it is also important to understand again that NEET state is very much a state of churn. So we see young people moving, and I think this is really important again from an intervention perspective. Young people put enormous effort into trying to find access to short-term training courses, short-term employment, re-enter the labor market or re-enter the education system, whether that is with rewriting their matric or whether that is about getting into the TVET system. But we also have to acknowledge that there aren't enough jobs for these young people, and there aren't enough places at the institutes of education for all of them to find access to. So the reason why so many of these young people without a matric become so vulnerable, or one of the reasons, is also because colleges and employers have the opportunity to inflate their entry requirements, right? So if there aren't sufficient jobs and there is an overflow almost of young people trying to find a job, both employers and TVET colleges inflate their requirements to having at least a matric. So there is a lot of adjusting that needs to be done at different pieces of the system to ensure that all young people actually get a chance to reconnect to the opportunities that are out there.
Thanks very much, Ariana. There's a couple of extra comments here in the chat, not so much questions, but comments, but maybe you'd like to respond to them. Prof. Filancomo also saying a successful and productive economy requires a rigorous and adaptive educational system. Entrepreneurship can never be the silver bullet. And Crystal Duncan-Williams from Youth Capital agreeing and saying we need an education system that provides youth with more of the softer skills that equip them for an ever-changing world of work. The current curriculum does little to equip young people with critical thinking and strong communication skills. I don't know if you'd like to respond to either of those inputs or comments.
I'm waiting to see if Mario wants to go, but I'm happy to go first. I think we all agree with both those comments. Sorry, Mario, do you want to go first?
No, after you, Ariana.
You know, what comes through these comments, and I think what lives in all of our minds who've worked on this paper and who work a lot on so-called youth development and with young people, is what is really lacking in the policy environment, and I think in society at large, is an actual real commitment to delivering high quality services to young people, whether that is education or career guidance or health services and mental health services. We listen to young people who look for support and look for opportunities and don't find it, or don't find the kind of support that would really help them forward. And so the Mario referred to it, the National Pathway Management Network and the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention, I think both do a really good job at bringing across the message that we need to start putting young people central in the design and the delivery of services. But I think it really, really needs a commitment beyond the labor market and really needs to extend into the range of services that's available and is offered to young people. If we don't commit to making those services of the highest quality, we will continue to be stuck in this particular cycle. Thank you.
Just to add on to what Ariana said there, I think there's a lot we could do as a society to address the vulnerabilities of young people and improve outcomes for young people that don't necessarily require a massive new program. They don't necessarily require a whole lot of money, but maybe do require this commitment and collaboration, greater commitment and greater collaboration by stakeholders across society. And I think that if there was more of that, if there was just a greater sense of let's all work together across the different sectors of society, let's commit our efforts, our resources, our energies to doing everything we can to tackle the challenges that young people face in the education system and in the labor market. I think we could achieve a lot more than we currently are doing, and arrest a little bit this increasingly high numbers of youth who are unemployed. And that's not to say that there aren't structural changes needed. I think those are definitely needed. So, I mean, if one looks at the recent QLFS data, you see that the sectors that contributed most to the economic growth of the last quarter were mining and the finance sector. But those aren't necessarily the sectors that absorb high numbers of labor. And the finance sector tends to absorb highly skilled labor. So there are structural changes needed to ensure that growth occurs where labor can be absorbed. But I think there's also a lot more we could do just with a greater sense of collaboration. And then I agree with Crystal as well about the importance of those soft skills. I think of the most recent World Economic Forum, I think the World of Work report, I think it's called. I found that the top 10 skills amongst employers who were surveyed for that had to do with critical thinking skills and interpersonal skills. And those aren't necessarily skills that require many years of being in school or at university or college to acquire. So we could be creative there, I think, around delivering those skills that are in demand and very important to be successful in the labor market.
Thanks, Mario. And Ariana, before you, there's three more comments or questions in the chat here. First from Wandile Maweni, who's at MISTRA, who says, what will be the effect or impact of the 4IR on youth employment and employability going forward post-COVID? And then from Abba Omar, also at MISTRA, what does the panel think of the initiatives such as Harambee, which are meant to prepare youth for employment, especially in the context of anemic economic growth? And so let's perhaps take those two, and then there's a third from Prof. Susan Boyson that will come to you next.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Let me start with the first one on the fourth industrial revolution on youth employment and employability. So, not taking from our presentation or the paper, but I think if we are to just look in general, what we know and we see is the fourth industrial revolution requires a new set of skills, for anyone who needs to be employed, whether it's youth or the older generation. So when you look at it, youth, they are still in the avenue for learning, so they might actually be better equipped to learn the new skills that are required for the fourth industrial revolution compared to the older generation, which means we might have a situation where youth employment and employability might actually increase in future. But this depends on whether we have equipped the youth with the skills that the fourth industrial revolution requires. So one study that was actually done actually said, with the fourth industrial revolution coming, from the time we get to 2020 going forward, the structure of how employment is itself is actually going to change. And I think it's a reflection of those skills that are being needed by the fourth industrial revolution. So if we prepared our youth to be able to take the jobs that are required by the fourth industrial revolution, so if we are to look mostly like in the where one is needed, like a lot of people would do coding into the data science and all those things, youth can easily do that. But have we equipped them to do that? It's a question that we can't really answer with our study at the moment, but going forward, there is, I think, room to make youth more employable with the Industrial Revolution in place. And I think the COVID pandemic has actually created that room because it made a lot of things change. So as people, we are generally, we don't like change, but COVID is actually forcing us to do those changes, which I think it can actually help the Industrial Revolution and the skills that people need. Because like now people, they are even talking about a 4-day working week because everyone has been working from home. So there are changes that we can easily do because of what the pandemic has done. The Harambee question, I can leave it to Ariane. I think she might be better positioned to answer that particular question.
Thank you, Gibson. But maybe first checking if Mario, from their particular youth capital background, doesn't want to add something on 4IR.
No, I'll just echo what Gibson said. I think that there will be jobs lost on account of 4IR, but also jobs created. And what's important is, are we providing young people the skills needed to access the new opportunities, new jobs created? And also the other important point, to echo what Gibson said, is that not only going to be young people who need training to be relevant in the new economy, but also those of us who are already in the world of work. We also need to keep upskilling and reskilling as technology changes.
Thank you. The Harambee question and the anemic economic growth, I like that expression, or even though it's actually very sad. There's obviously always two sides to, and potentially more, to this unemployment equation, and one could wonder why so much effort goes into preparing young people while we don't have sufficient economic growth to create the jobs that would allow these young people to find the job. But I think that the value of an initiative such as Harambee, and now also the National Pathway Management Network, is to try and deal with a number of the inefficiencies within the labor market. So even if there were sufficient jobs available and being created, we know that for many young people at the moment, it is very difficult to look for a job efficiently, or to even be able to take up a job if it would be available. So I think that there is great value in working with young people to make sure that they have a better sense of what is available for them and what is required of them, and to make sure that several of the barriers that exist to accessing and to looking for a job and accessing a job are flattened for them. And so in that respect, I think that Harambee does an important job. It also reaches out to employers, so it actually doesn't only work on the side of the young person, but also works with employers to try and understand what the needs are exactly, and whether positions really do need to be filled with someone who has a higher level of education, to try and give an opportunity or a first foot into the door also to young people who don't have higher levels of education. So I think that there is an absolute place for those kinds of interventions in the current situation, but there is obviously also a huge need to look at how the economy can be supported to grow and grow inclusively, and I think there is a lot of work to be done, not only for interventions like Harambee, but also us researchers, to better understand the demand side of the labor market. I think we very often run into data gaps to really understand what it is that employers need and look for in employees, and what could better support them in order to create jobs in general and jobs for young people in particular. I hope that answered that question.
Thanks, Ariana and Mario and Gibson. So another question here from Professor Susan Boyson. Could you estimate in broad terms the extent to which the totality of the range of current government and private initiatives are sufficient to address the deficits in creating employment and keeping the youth in the education system? And another from Lorien Kleinhans. The youth employment intervention measures offered by governments, such as the teaching assistants in primary schools, has had a good impact on unemployed youth that we work with. This has exposed them to learning and education environment and benefits thereof, as well as boosting self-confidence after the pandemic. But unfortunately, many contracts ended after 2 months. Perhaps you could respond to those couple of comments and questions.
I'm happy to respond to the one from Lorien. I mentioned the survey we recently did earlier on young people who were involved in the basic education employment intervention and schools that had these assistants placed at them. I think also important to note that we discovered that in doing research around this, that there were school assistant programs and initiatives that existed before the basic education employment intervention. And these typically are for a period of 12 months. And so I think I agree that the duration of the basic education employment intervention of 3 months, that was then extended to 4 months, was very short, particularly if one considers that it started during the school holiday period. And that notwithstanding, they proved to be invaluable to both young people and schools, and showed that this is an initiative worth investing in and worth continuing. And we know that there's work being done into doing a phase 2 of the program starting in August, from what I last heard. But I do agree that these kinds of opportunities to be as valuable as they could be for young people, I think they should be longer. I think that's of greater value to both the young person, him or herself, as well as to the school, to have somebody there for a lengthier period of time, invested in the school, contributing to the learning in the classroom, or to the admin load of teachers or admin staff at schools. But we think that these kinds of initiatives are ones we should be investing in, and to be of real value, they should build the skills of young people so that they don't go from one short-term opportunity to the next short-term opportunity and churn through these short-term opportunities, but rather find a meaningful short-term opportunity. Their confidence is built, their skills are built, they gain experience of the world of work, and then they are supported to their next best opportunity that progresses them further in their career journey, and into something more sustainable and more long-term. So these opportunities should be designed as stepping stone opportunities and not stopgap measures to temporarily provide relief for young people.
I can try and have a go at Susan's question, but Mario, please jump in when you feel like it, and Gibson. I think that the totality of all the initiatives that exist should be paying off much more than what they do at the moment. There's enormous amounts of resources being pumped in different government departments and programs, and yet we see very little change. There is some change, but it's very little and it's very slow in terms of young people being able to stick to the education system, navigate their way through the education system, and finding their way into employment or self-employment. There are too many gaps in the overall package of services. And as I said earlier, I think there isn't enough of a commitment to high level quality implementation of the initiatives. I think one of the problems that government faces, which is not, I think, unique to South Africa, but is that different departments and initiatives continue to work very much in silos, and fail to understand young people as a whole young person that faces different deprivations at the same time. And people who know me will have heard me say this before. I think it is really crucial that we understand young people, the majority of young people, as living in income poverty, in isolated communities, accessing low quality education for the most part, especially during COVID, also then again being faced with food insecurity, and lacking the kinds of social and cultural capital that could really help move them forward. And so while there are initiatives that try to deal with one or two of those aspects, they don't necessarily work together to really support a young person with those different aspects of deprivation. And I think that that is one huge lack in the system. I also think that there is, and this actually then feeds straight into Sibusiso's question, there isn't enough attention to what living in deprivation and struggling through the different systems does to young people's emotional health. And I think that there could be much more attention, dedicated attention given to that already within the education system, so that young people feel supported and heard before they drop out of the schooling system or before they leave the schooling system. It isn't all dropouts. So I think I'm not sure that that entirely answers your question, Susan. There's an enormous amount of resources being put into all these initiatives, and I think that they could be strengthened and targeted more strongly to really support the different aspects of young people's lives, and that is not happening at the moment. Again, I think the PYEI, the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention, is an attempt to begin that, but it's not entirely clear yet how that will eventually pay off. And it's also not entirely clear how much attention can really be given to the different challenges in young people's lives. And so that really links me to that question of mental health. I agree, Sibusiso, so it's not really a question, it's more of a statement. I think many of us would agree that it is really imperative to build policy strategies, but even more important, I think, is to think very carefully about high quality implementation. We have some really nicely formulated policies that then really fail when it comes to implementation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ariana. Mario or Gibson, would you like to add anything else on the mental health question that was raised on the chat here? Profil Nkomo saying, I remain worried about the mental health state of youth after they've sustained heavy blows from a poor performing economy and COVID-19. Policy strategies after COVID are an imperative and have to be developed now.
I think I might leave that one to Gibson, if you'd like to respond. I just wanted to add to what Susan has asked. One of the National Planning Commission's recent reports, I think it's the one on youth labour market transitions. I've tried to download it, but I think the MPC's website is a bit slow at the moment. But I think in that report, I think it's one of the others. They tried to quantify the investments in youth development across different sectors and programs. And that report provided some sense of figure in terms of how much is invested into youth development. I'll keep trying to access it and post it in the chat. But if I'm unsuccessful, I'd recommend having a look at that report.
Okay, so on mental health, I do agree with you, Prof. Nkomo, there, when you're saying the strategies need to be developed. So one thing I think which is quite sad during the pandemic is, so there is one group there, so South Africa Depressive and Anxiety Group, which deals with mental health issues. So what they actually have, as much as there is a group that is supposed to help people who are affected by depression or stress, during the pandemic, they were also affected. So they have a call center where the number of agencies who have to answer those calls actually decreased significantly. So the report that I was reading from them actually said you could actually have calls that will go for so long without being answered. And most probably these are people who actually need help because the few that they manage to pick, they are people most probably who are in the verge of committing suicide, because there was actually, within that website, they actually say the number of youth who actually committed suicide during the pandemic actually increased significantly compared to the ones they've always registered on any other day. Then another study that we did using a different data set, it wasn't a nationally representative survey, but what we found in that particular group is the mental health, the prevalence was significantly high, way higher than the numbers that we found here, which is actually telling us that there might actually be need to reach to even much smaller groups of people, because if we are to look at a national representative survey, which is telling us that we have this level of depressive symptoms, but there is a special group of people who actually need this particular help and they are not getting it, because with that particular survey, we found more than 70% who had depressive symptoms, which is quite a significant number, but we can't really generalize it to everyone within South Africa. But it is telling us that out there are a lot of people who are actually having depressive symptoms. So yes, we agree that there are policies that specifically need to be done, not only during the pandemic, but continuously even after these lockdown measures have been lifted. But we see that the depressive symptoms actually continue to increase. So the measures need to continue to be there in the long run. Yeah.
Thanks, Gibson. Let me read out another comment here from Crystal Duncan Williams, but also we've still got time for a few more questions. So if you'd like to ask another question, please do so, pop it in the chat or raise your hand. But Crystal says, in order for all the government interventions to really give a good return on investment, we need better coordination between government and CSOs, in addition to better interdepartmental cooperation, as Ariana said. Government does a poor job of learning from mistakes and learning from other players who have knowledge and experience. The Basic Education Employment Initiative is a perfect example of this, as Mario has explained. Yeah, can I hand over to, perhaps, do you want to start, Mario, in responding to Crystal, and then we'll go to Gibson and Ariana?
Just to echo what Crystal has said, so maybe just referencing the Basic Education Employment Intervention, some of the organizations that we spoke with who had been implementing school assistant programs where they've been working for a number of years in placing young people at schools for periods of at least 12 months. They said to us that they'd not been consulted at all about the Basic Education Employment Intervention, and that they just kind of been told about it and it went ahead, it was implemented without really getting the input of those in the space who had already been doing this work and learning from them what worked well, what didn't, what should be kept in mind. And so Crystal often uses the phrase of we don't need to reinvent the wheel in some of these interventions. We could have a look at what's already working and kind of scale those, amplify those. And so I agree that there is a greater need for coordination, greater collaboration between stakeholders already in the space to help to improve outcomes for youth. I think if we just worked a little bit better together, we'd probably achieve a whole lot more than we currently are achieving, despite from me feeling that we don't have as much as we should be able to show given the investments that's being made.
Thanks, Mario. Gibson, would you like to add anything?
Now for this one, I'll skip. I will leave it there.
Okay, then let me just read out a response here from Crystal saying, I think mental health support requires some innovative solutions. If we look at the use of lay counsellors in the support of people living with HIV, I think there's an opportunity to train and use lay counsellors to address the growing and urgent needs for mental health interventions amongst the youth. Ariana, I see you're back in the chat. Crystal just made a couple of points about mental health support and interventions for that, but also on better government coordination with civil society organisations and interdepartmental cooperation, as you were picking up on before. Ariana, if you'd like to add anything else on mental health interventions, you're very welcome to. But I'll also just invite any further questions before we have time for a couple more before we need to wrap up. Okay, Annalile, do you think that the 350 Rand incentive was a success and if it had a good impact on youth?
Okay, so I think when you look at the other studies that have been, so there are studies that have been done on the impact of these grants on youth, and they actually showed that they did have a significant impact on youth and households where those particular youth actually come from, where it actually cushioned them during the pandemic. But on the other side of it, when you look at it, 350, it's a very small amount compared to what households need for their day-to-day activities, where the one particular commodity, like which everyone is talking about, is the significant increase in prices for cooking oil. So where they even gave an example of how many bottles of cooking oil one can actually buy with the 350. So you actually see that as much as it might have helped a bit, it was still far lower than what the households actually needed for their day-to-day activities. Yeah. Yes, I don't know if Ariane has something to add on the grants there.
No, other than that, we know that it was a bit of a struggle for some to access the grant, but it definitely managed to, as the other social grants, it manages to keep people out of the most dire levels of poverty. It is, of course, not sufficient, as Gibson said, to fully cover. I mean, it could never be sufficient to cover living expenses or even things as transport to and from work. But yeah, it was, I think, it was the best thing that could be done as quickly as possible, given that the social grant system and distribution system existed. And so it was one way of rapidly getting some cash into households that really needed it the most. So it would never be sufficient, but it was a great intervention at the time to at least keep the worst from going on. But Mario might have something to add there as well.
I think the 350 Rand grant showed, it visualized the scale of the need. And I remember one morning driving past the post office, and this was early in the morning, probably around 8-ish, and the queue was already very long. And it was quite heartbreaking to see the scale of the need of people who had previously been excluded from any social grants. And one wonders, we always have this almost like a group of, if you will, invisible people who were suddenly made visible because this grant had been made available. And what's happened since the grant has been brought to an end. And so is it enough in terms of the amount? Certainly not. It's below the food poverty line, and probably only helps to an extent, but doesn't alleviate distress and the vulnerability to food insecurity. But I think it has shown. I think it has shown that we need to provide a measure of social assistance to this population of people who previously had not had access to social assistance support.
Thanks, Mario. Gibson, do you want to add anything on this?
No, I came in first, so I've already said what I wanted to say,
great.
but
Right.
I think just echoing the point that Ariane talked about that. So when you look at one of the studies that was done, they actually highlighted that I think as much as these grants did help, some of them, it actually came way too late for the people who needed it, and it didn't manage to reach everyone who also needed it, which I think is just the problems that the administrators faced in terms of just implementing it in the very short possible time that we had in terms of when the pandemic happened and when the grant was implemented. Yeah.
Thanks, Gibson. Okay, I can't see any more questions in the chat, so let us wrap up here. I just want to say a tremendous thanks to the three authors for presenting today, for giving their time to today's presentation, but also to contributing this working paper. As I was saying at the beginning, although I don't know how much of this was received because of the sound quality issues I was facing, this working paper is also a chapter in MISTRA's forthcoming book on youth and national development. So it's been part of a broader project to look at the role of young people in national development in South Africa, locating that in kind of a global context of challenges facing young people, but also looking particularly at the historical, structural and contextual issues that face young people in South Africa today, and that pose an impediment to them realizing meaningful contributions and participation to national development. So looking at structural challenges, but also looking at the agency that young people exercise in various ways, and in ways that often challenge assumptions about the role of youth. So thanks to the authors for presenting today. The book will be launched toward the end of this year, and contains contributions from across academia, from practitioners, from activists, a number of whom are young people themselves, and who bring insights into the various policy issues, making policy recommendations, but also looking at things around youth political engagement and activism, identity formation, negotiating pathways through education, skills development, employment. And it picks up on some of the queries raised today around entrepreneurship, for example, but also the broader policy environment and its current limitations. So this is one of the first engagements over the outputs of the project that we've been sharing with you today, and we look forward to more of those over coming months, and particularly as the book itself is launched. I think Spokazi, our communications officer, mentioned in the chat earlier that the working paper is available on the website, but I think you also may have received it by email, so you can refer to that again. But just to say thank you again to the authors, a number of whom I can see have attended today, and thank you all very much for participating, for the important interventions made by the paper itself about understanding young people in context, about the need for enabling mechanisms through policy for social assistance, mental health interventions, and particularly overall for comprehensive and consistent policy interventions for young people. So thank you everybody for attending today. The session has been recorded so that people who missed it or who missed parts of it can also recap. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Gibson, Ariana, and Mario.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thanks for the